Welcome, welcome, listeners, friends, the general collective McFleet. We are back at my movie house with another solo episode with me. And you know what that means? It's time for a movie roundup, of course. We are well into October, and it hit me that I haven't done a roundup for you. Big gasp, I know, especially because this month I know so many people are watching some creepy gems, both new and old. So, of course, for today, we're going to be talking horror. But I thought I would give you a roundup of some lesser known horror movies because, well, I mean, that's kind of the point of this podcast, talking about hidden treasures that I think deserve a lot more love. And some of these are known within film circles, of course, but perhaps not to everyone. So I'm really excited about today. It was honestly kind of hard narrowing these down because these solo episodes are usually a lot shorter. But you know what? If you like it, we can always do another little horror movie roundup. It doesn't have to be limited to October, but enough of my yapping. Let's just dive into these. Some of them will be a lot more serious and slow. Others are just weird and funny horror movies. So, yeah, I'm giving you variety. It's the spice of life. I'm going to start us off with a macabre and dark comedy that's also a incredibly unsettling pick, and that's 1969's The Cremator by Uri Hertz, based on a novel by Ladislav Fuchs. This one is part of the Czech New Wave movement. It's very celebrated within it as well. And the story takes us to 1930s Prague, where we meet a man, Carol, a strange man. He's a cremator. In his spare time, he likes reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he starts having these strange ideas about reincarnation as the only solution to human suffering. And suddenly, through ways that I won't get into, he's recruited by the Nazi Party because he has some German heritage. And this makes him spiral into a deeply disturbing worldview that leads him to become a killer, basically. And we watch as he spouts these insane monologues and grows progressively more out of touch with reality. It's very deranged. And what I find interesting is, although it's very clear what party he's working for, the party's never outright named. It's just referred to as the party. It's also worthwhile mentioning that Hertz himself was a Holocaust survivor. Miraculously, his immediate family survived, but he lost about 60 family members. And he heard about this novel and he wanted to adapt it. But after reading the novel, he wanted to change it quite a bit, but still keep those key themes from the film. So he worked with Fuchs on the screenplay for over a year. And a huge standout of this film is the imagery. No doubt there. And like many of other films within the Czech New Wave, it relies a lot on these unconventional images and camera work. You get these bizarre fisheye close-ups that just make our lead look so much creepier than he already is. You get this rapid editing and quick cuts as well that disorient you, but they're also supposed to mimic our lead's mental state, which is all over the place. Plus, these images that are put to screen are just done randomly in the middle of conversations, just injected in. It's all very bizarre, but in such a gripping way. And as I also mentioned, Hertz incorporates some dark humor as well. This was partially done to keep the film from being censored at the time. So, yeah, I mean, it's a wildly unique movie, probably the most unique when it comes to the subject matter that it's tackling, but it's effective and a definite standout, and I highly recommend checking it out. Next up, we have a movie very, very dear to me. I would say it's probably the most beautiful horror on this list. Very strange thing to say, I know, but if you watch it, you know what I mean. And that's 1964's Kwaidan by Masaki Kobayashi. Yes, that is right. The Kobayashi, who did The Human Condition and one of my personal favorite samurai films, Harakiri. But yeah, he did this anthology supernatural horror movie called Kwaidan. The title literally means ghost story, and we get four Japanese folk tales here. They're actually based on the stories by Lafcadio Hearn's folk tales. Hearn was actually of Greek-Irish descent. He moved to the US in 1869, and then he later moved to Japan, where he changed his name to Yakumo Koizumi. But anyway, here, as I said, we get four stories. I'm not going to describe them all today, but the four stories are The Black Hare, The Woman of the Snow, Hoichi the Earless, and In a Cup of Tea. My personal favorites are Black Hair and Hoichi the Earless, the latter of which has that iconic imagery I'm sure some of you have seen, which features our lead covered with the text of a sutra on his entire body, including his face, to make him invisible to ghosts. Actually, side note, I saw some very similar imagery in Exuma from 2023, which I watched a few weeks ago on Shudder. Have any of you seen that? Let me know. But very, very similar stuff done there that's clearly inspired by Quaiden. But yeah, this film was a success. It won the Special Jury Prize at the 1965 Cannes Film Festival, and it received an Academy Award nomination for Best Foreign Language Film. It's visually a stunner. You have these super colorful hand painted sets. They were actually built in an airplane hangar, which was the only place big enough to accommodate these sets. And at the time, it was the most expensive film to be made in Japan, if you can believe it. So much so that it exhausted its budget 3 quarters into production, causing Kobayashi to sell his home. But the result is gorgeous. Things look like they're from another world, from these dark fairy tales, basically. And to top it all off, you get this fantastic experimental score by Toru Takemitsu. It's fabulous. It uses the movie's sound design to its advantage too, also incorporating these natural noises. It's also very minimalist and atmospheric and haunting, and just creates this perfect sort of slow horror, creepy vibe, just building on this sense of unease that grips you. I definitely urge all of you to watch this, particularly the restoration on the Criterion channel. It's a 3 hour long movie. I know, I know. But like I said, it's also an anthology, so you don't have to watch it in one sitting, although, I mean, you should. I did, wink, wink. But yeah, that's number two. We are now on to my number three pick. And switching gears tonally here for a moment, I'm going to go with Bill Gunn's or I should say, once underappreciated classic, Ganja and Hess from 1973, which I actually just recently bought a physical copy of right here. I really do love this movie, although I understand it won't be for everyone. Granted, a lot of movies on this list fall under this category, but just trust me, Gunn manages to mix art house, horror, black exploitation, and I don't even know what else to create something that really is just so haunting. The movie introduces us to Dr. Hess Green, played by Dwayne Jones, whom you may remember from Night of the Living Dead. But so he becomes a vampire after his assistant, played by Gunn himself, stabs him with an ancient dagger that is cursed. And so Dr. Green now obviously thirsts for blood, but at the same time, he falls in love with his assistant's wife, Ganja, played by Marlene Clark, who eventually finds out about him being a vampire. And I mean, there's just so much to appreciate here. The movie is loaded with visual and narrative symbolism. It really does feel like a trance-like trip at times, but overall, it's just filled with these metaphors for sexuality, addiction, self-empowerment, while also delving into class and racial dynamics and religion, just really capturing the complexities and issues with Black life and identity in the 70s in America. And I do think that although the film can be difficult to follow and it can come across as chaotic, it all feels very, very deliberate. As I mentioned, the movie is now considered a cult classic, but at the time that it came out, it was not. And it truly is such a disheartening story. Basically, after the release of what's regarded as the first ever blaxploitation horror, 1972's Blackula, producers wanted to capitalize on its success and they asked Gunn to make them something similar. Now, what Gunn did is he took those funds and ran with it basically into an entirely different direction, which was art house horror. And so Ganja and Hess played at the Cannes Film Festival in 1973. It got a standing ovation and won the Critics' Choice Prize. But by the time Gunn got back to America, critics ripped it apart. It suffered from being recut by distributors who re-released it after selling it to a grindhouse company under some pretty lame titles like, what was it? Vampires of Harlem, Black Vampire, Blood Couple, and so on. And Gunn was furious. He actually wrote a letter to the New York Times titled "To Be a Black Artist," where he wrote about how critics didn't even bother to understand the film. And he notably declared, quote, that there are times when the white critic must sit down and listen. If he cannot listen and learn, then he must not concern himself with black creativity. And finally, in 2018, Kino Lorber and Scorsese's Film Foundation collaborated to restore Ganja and Hess and remaster it, releasing it how it was originally intended. And you can buy it off of the Kino Lorber website, which is how I got my copy. And I think it's great. And I actually got another title from Gunn from Kino. I don't have it yet. It needs to come in. It's 1980s Personal Problems. So I'll report back later after I check that one out as well. Moving on to number 4, it's a film by Andrei Zulawski. Gasp, is it Possession? No, it is not, although I do love Possession so much. And I think it's the better film to the one that I'm about to share. But I think that, at least with my listeners, a bunch of you have already seen Possession. So I'm going to go with Zulawski's feature film debut from 1971, The Third Part of the Night, which I still think is a fantastic film. Also, a very fascinating one to watch too, as it really sets the stage and tone for his career to come later on. It's set during the occupation of Poland during the Second World War, and we follow a man, Mikhail, who literally at the movie's start loses his wife, child, and mother. And almost instantly, Zulawski thrusts you in this jarring world where we just watch as our lead tries to avoid death. He tries joining the resistance, all while dealing with so much grief and guilt, while he's trying to survive, basically. And I was stunned when I watched this. It plays out like a relentless nightmare. Things aren't what they seem. It's this surreal world filled with doppelgangers, a motif that he later revisits in Possession, of course, dreamscapes, or nightmares, really, and memories. Plus, you get Zulawski's trademark erratic camera work and frenetic score to further enhance your disorienting experience. This movie just truly establishes his distinctive cinematic voice, even with his signature color palette and techniques that he does visually. I should also quickly mention the third part of the night pulls from his father's experiences with the Home Army during the Second World War. He also co wrote the script with him, and this included the very real work at the time at scientific institutes that bred lice for disease research. And this vaccine was made for the German army specifically, and residents who participated in this research were granted a degree of protection. So, all of this serves as a metaphor in the film for these people who, besides being emotionally and physically drained, they're also experiencing extreme mental drainage too. And so Zulawski uses all of this as a tool to showcase the hell itself that the people of Poland were living in at the time. So that's my number 4 pick. Whew, I was going to say we're getting dark here, and then I remembered it's a horror movie roundup, so of course it is. You're buckled up with me here now, folks. Next up is a Bergman movie. I'm sure some of you know what it is, since he didn't dabble in horror much, really. And that's 1968's Hour of the Wolf, which I chatted about a bit on my first episode with Seth, so you can go check that out if you please. So, Hour of the Wolf. The movie takes us to a remote island. I believe this was filmed on Faro. And our lead, Johann, a very troubled artist played by Max von Sydow, lives there with his pregnant wife, Alma, played by Liv Ullmann. And they're experiencing these overwhelming feelings of dread, mainly coming from Johann, who has these recurring paranoid nightmares that he decides to tell his wife during the Hour of the Wolf, which is between midnight and dawn, which, according to Swedish folklore, is allegedly when the most deaths and births occur. And so Johann has these visions. Even his wife does eventually, too. And things just spiral and spiral after they meet these rich neighbors of theirs. They're weird, and they go to visit them. So I really don't want to say more. It's a psychological trip of a film that's best experienced going in blind. And the movie does carry some similarities to the iconic Persona as well. That sort of disintegration of one's identity. Bergman has said he came up with this story when he had his own Hour of the Wolf. So some of the inspirations for the more surreal and nightmarish sequences came from his own nightmares, including a woman taking off her own face, creatures walking on ceilings, and so on. And Ullmann, who I believe was still in a relationship with Bergman at the time. Actually, yes, she was pregnant with their child. Anyway, she was a bit confused about the film while shooting it, but she said she was unsettled by the traits of von Sydow's character as they seemed reminiscent of Bergman himself. So she was frightened too. And yeah, I mean, the character of Johann was meant to function as Bergman's alter ego. This film is the first in a trilogy with Max von Sydow as his alter ego, along with Shame and The Passion of Anna. And yeah, many consider this film to be Bergman's only horror film. You really get some disturbing and surrealist imagery that has inspired so many filmmakers in the years to come, especially within the folk horror genre. So, yeah, in my opinion, this is required viewing, especially if you're wanting to get into Bergman, definitely. For number 6, we're heading back to Japan with 1960s Jigoku by Nobuo Nakagawa. I talk about this film somewhat often online, notably because it carries the best depiction of hell in its final act that I have ever seen, ever. It's truly what I imagine hell to be like. So, well done, Nakagawa. And this film is unassuming at the start. By that, I don't mean that it's not morbid, because it very much so is. But for an hour and 41 minutes, it really does take its time before it plunges you into this hellscape. So we meet Shiro, a young theology student, and he's just recently become engaged to his girlfriend, Yukiko, who is the daughter of his professor. And so he leaves her home at the start of the film. He gets in his friend's car, Tamura, and Tamura is more relaxed of the two. He doesn't care for much, really. And they get into a hit and run and kill someone on this way, leaving Yukiko's house. And he gets in his friend's car, Tamura, and Tamura is much more relaxed of the two. He doesn't care for much. And they get into a hit and run and they kill someone. But it's not just anyone, it's a Yakuza member. And Shiro wants to stop, Tamura doesn't, and he keeps driving. But the Yakuza's mother sees them and she decides that she wants revenge. And then from there, Tamura feels no guilt. Shiro wants to go to the cops. And as the story progresses, bad things keeps happening to Shiro. More people plot revenge, and he's just filled with guilt and paranoia. There's a devilish doppelganger thrown into the mix. I know I'm trying to avoid spoilers as much as I can, so this all just sounds hectic, I'm sure. But eventually, we get to the insanity of the final act, where many, many characters find themselves in hell. And remember, this came out in 1960, and it's so much more outrageous with its outright gore and imagery than some of the other movies that were being made at the time. It's truly shocking for the time it came out in. And it's a film where people pay for all of their sins. It's void of any optimism. It's just visceral and extreme, showing hell for what it should be shown as, basically. It's one of those movies that just deserves to be seen instead of described. And after watching it, you'll understand why Nakagawa had a title for a while as the master of Japan-esque horror. Last I checked, it's on the Criterion channel, so go look for yourself. We have another Czech film up next, this time by the legendary Vera Chytilova of Daisy's fame. And this one is a sleeper horror, for me at least. I knew nothing about it. It was another random Criterion channel find, and that's 1987's Wolf's Hole, which is Chytilova's take on an 80s teen slasher. Yet what she does so successfully is she takes very familiar tropes of the genre that when you're watching, you're like, ah, I know where this is going. But instead, she completely abolishes those tropes, foregoing any gory deaths, final girls, or any of the stereotypes of promiscuous teenagers. It's a really clever film. So, with Wolf's Hole, we meet a group of teens, as I mentioned, who are selected to take part in this skiing workshop on a mountain. They all come from different schools, and there are supposed to be 10 of them selected. Yet we discovered that 11 have arrived, and they all claim that they were invited. And from there, the adults, the camp supervisors, claim that there should only be 10 of them, and that one of them is an intruder. Gasp, of course. And after this event that happens, I'm trying not to spoil anything, they're suddenly stuck in their lodge. They can't contact anyone outside, and things start to get weird. Their supervisors turn hostile. That's where I'm going to stop talking about the plot. And it's clear that with this one, Hitalova is shining a light on authoritarian oppression with this film. She's forcing us to take stock and look at the authority figures in our lives. She then asks the viewer to essentially take a stand against all of this. And through these kids, showcases how strong we can truly be when we band together, which is, of course, something that the teens touch on numerous times in the film as well. And I actually found a quote from Hitalova from the same year this film came out, where she stated that she wanted to direct a sci fi or a horror film because it's the only way to show reality. So that's what she did. And this is great. As I said, it's very weird and unsettling. The atmosphere is disorienting. The fast zooms and the editing left me really antsy, probably because I kept waiting for Hitalova to give us those common tropes of the 80s teen slasher genre. But she doesn't. And she keeps you so on edge. So, yeah, this is more psychological than it is gory, but it's fun. I really do enjoy it. And you get some pretty snazzy 80s ski attire, plus an era appropriate synth score as well. All right, gang, final three. We are speeding along. Of course, I had to include a film by Jean Rollin. If you've listened to me talk about horror movies online before, you know I'm a fan of Jean Rollin's style of just kind of trashy French B movie, yet oddly poetic horror, if that makes sense. It's very specific. He was a fascinating filmmaker, no doubt. And if you're looking for dreamy and delicate sort of horror movies, peek into his filmography. But for today, I'm going to go with 1973's The Iron Rose, one of Roland's personal favorites that also happens to forego one of the staples in many of his movies, and that's vampires. So there's no vampires here. Instead, we meet a young man and woman. They're introduced at a wedding reception, and they make plans to go on a date. When they meet up, they decide they'll have a picnic, and they choose a seemingly empty cemetery as their location. Romantic? I don't know. But since I don't want to spoil anything, all I'll say is some creepy stuff happens and night falls. And next thing you know, they can't find their way out of the cemetery. And things get progressively more eerie. The Iron Rose is one of Jean Rollin's most subtle and delicate films, I would say. It's very slow and poetically macabre, toying with themes of love, life, death, the passage of time, and so on. You get tons of visual metaphors here too, constantly seeing things that were once vibrant but are now decaying, reminding us that everything is fleeting. Even the title of the film itself, An Iron Rose, is so different to what a traditional and real rose is. It's not this symbol of love, it's colorless and frigid and void of emotion. Look at me getting poetic here. Ooh. Anyway, Roland was known for his powerful and seductive female leads. And the lead girl here is just that too. Francois Pascal, who plays the girl, we never get their names, is an utter standout in this. She gives a performance that descends into madness in such an instinctual way that just leaves you hypnotized. I have so much more I can say here about this movie and so many others. So honestly, if you want a Roland specific episode, holler at me in the comments or DMs anywhere. I would love to do an episode on his work. All right, next up is, I would say, a pretty deep cut. It's a film that wasn't well received when it came out, but since then I feel like it's served as an inspiration for so many more modern horror films like Final Destination, or even more so, It Follows. And that's Tom Eberhardt's Sole Survivor from 1983. It also happens to be his debut at the time. And while I feel like it may have inspired those aforementioned films, I don't know for sure, don't quote me on that. It also drew from a lot of classics that I adore, such as Carnival of Souls, watch that by the way, elements of The Twilight Zone, and even in a way, the way that it was lit in the set design, I got hints of some Giallo gems too. But so what is it about? It's a simple premise that works. The film opens up with the most iconic imagery for its whole runtime. A TV station worker, Denise, survives a plane crash, and you literally see her strapped in her seat along with all this rubble and carnage around here of a plane crash. Visually, it looks great, and so she's the sole survivor. And death, essentially, is not happy. So now Denise is navigating near fatal accidents, poor girl, while being stalked by a gaggle of incredibly creepy strangers. She sees them lurking everywhere she goes. It's a film that, sure, it's a bit of a slow burn, but it builds tension so well, especially for a low budget film. It just goes to show that when you work with atmosphere and know what you're doing, you can really effectively create dread. And the movie just gets under your skin as we watch Denise wander through these empty spaces, just waiting for something to get her. I really want to check out more of Eberhardt's films. I've seen Night of the Comet from 1984. That was okay. Also a horror. It was fun, no doubt, but it was kind of like a more cheesy sort of 80s horror B movie with some hilarious lines. Where this one, Soul Survivor, is actually an effective slow burn horror. I believe you can catch this one on Shudder, so go mosey along if you're interested. Okay, we have made it for the last one of the day. I'm so excited for this. I wanted to go with something that's a little bit silly but fun. And I'm going to go with 1985's Mr. Vampire by Ricky Lau, a pretty iconic Hong Kong horror comedy that was produced by the beloved Sammo Hung. He's also an actor, director, martial artist, but he's known for his work in martial arts films, notably also with Jackie Chan. But anyway, Mr. Vampire is pretty notable in the Jiangxi film genre. The first of the genre is considered to be Sammo Hung's Encounters of the Spooky Kind from 1980. And so, what are the Jiangxi, you may ask? They're a part of Chinese folklore of hopping vampires, and they hop around with their arms out wide, and they're out to kill and absorb the life force of humans and animals. And so, why do they hop? Because their rotting bodies are so stiff from rigor mortis that they have to hop. And yes, this sounds very silly. And yes, it's played up for comedic effect, but they're villains and they're dangerous in this world, you know? And throughout the 80s, these Hong Kong vampire movies are or were essentially a mishmash of comedy, horror, and kung fu. So you're laughing, but you're also like, damn, that's some great fighting choreography. And Mr. Vampire has all of that. It was so successful, in fact, that it spawned four sequels, a play, a video game, merch, and so on. But so, Mr. Vampire, we meet a Taoist priest played by Lam Ching-ying, who, by the way, icon of the genre. Before he did this, he worked as Bruce Lee's assistant, of all people. But in this movie, he's a very capable priest. However, he has these two bumbling assistants who can't do anything right. They kind of have a bit of a Abbott and Costello shtick. And they basically resurrect a vampire to life. And now our leads need to use the powers within them, but also kung fu to eliminate the threat. And I love this take on a vampire story. It replaces cures familiar in Western vampire tales like garlic and crosses, and instead we see sticky rice used to counter vampire bites, holding your breath so they don't find you, and so on. It's just great fun, and the fight sequences are immaculately choreographed, as I said, and timed to comedic perfection. I just had this massive smile on my face throughout while I watched this. And it's one of those movies you throw on during the Halloween season with a bunch of your friends and you just howl. If you're a fan of Sammo Hung's action movies or even that sort of slapstick action comedy from Jackie Chan, but you still want that horror edge, check out Mr. Vampire. It's also on the Criterion channel. Can they just please pay me already? So there you have it, my friends. 10 horror films that I think deserve more love. If you've already seen any of these, let me know what you think. If you check them out and you love them, definitely let me know what you think. And I will see you next week for another episode of McFly's Movie House. Thank you for listening and happy watching. Bye.